The Ukrainian forces managed to recapture the northern parts of Kupyansk as well as several towns on the northern flank of Kupyansk, cutting off the supply lines on the western bank of the Uska River line for the Russian forces. At the same time, they started storming the first defensive positions of the Russians within the city. In turn, the Russians managed to make major gains in the Siversk section of the front line, capturing approximately 20 square kilometers, akin to what the Ukrainians have captured in the Kupyansk direction, with additional advances by the Russians along the border between the Kursk and Sumi regions within the Sumi region, to the south of Koshchentinivka, within Minirat, leaving just 4 square kilometers remaining under Ukrainian control, and additional advances within Hulyapole, gaining additional control over the northern flank of the city, almost having full control over the northern bank of the Haichu River. Starting out in the Kupyansk direction, the Ukrainians managed to regain control of the northern parts of the city, where they have pushed into the industrial area in the western parts and the farm area in the northern parts, as well as the residential areas, gaining full control over the northern flank of the city, as well as the fortifications near Radkivka and along the northern outskirts of the city. The forest patch areas, the forest lines here to the east of Counterattack, full recapture of Counterattack, and some of the fortifications to the north of the town. This completely pushes the Russian forces back from the northern flank of Kupyansk, where the Russians can no longer even attempt to resupply their forces within Kupyansk from the western bank of the Usk river line. That means the only supply route right now is through the river line itself, as well as with drones. The question now stands, just as any other encirclement, how many Russian forces are within Kupyansk? Well, the interesting thing is that even Deep State Map says that there's just a few Russian soldiers within the city itself. The Russian tactic is largely to have these infantrymen push through to take control over the city. As for building up their forces, that is not really possible without proper supply lines, and the Russian supply lines were always limited within the city. That means their hold of the city was not strong. Currently, the Russian forces are mainly centered around 3 different points. There is the southern apartment complex area, which the Ukrainians have started storming. There is the central apartment complex area, and then there's the northern apartment complex area, both connecting to each other. And there's the school area in the eastern parts of the city. So the Russian forces are mainly centered around these 3 locations, where the main one is the northern part, which is directly connected to the highway. Once the Ukrainians strengthened their offensive operations on the northern and western flanks, the Russians withdrew to these areas and are now withdrawing back to the school area and the apartment complex area. The objective is to hold control over the intersection here in the eastern parts of Kupyansk and hold their foothold within the city to prevent the Ukrainians from recapturing everything west of the Usk river line and set back the Russians a couple of weeks, if not months. The Ukrainians pushed through from the southern flank, regaining control over the southern residential area and the southern outskirts of the city, as well as parts of the southern apartment complex area. This forced the Russians to give up their positions in the area and start a withdrawal towards the school area. The Russians still hold some positions within the apartment complex area, but they are only having as few soldiers as possible to cover for the retreat of their forces back towards the school area. With this, the Russians are working on securing the southern and western flanks of the intersection here in the eastern parts of Kupyansk against the Ukrainian forces storming from the south. This is why the advances by the Ukrainians in the south is much less than at the north, because they are within close proximity to this intersection. The Ukrainians first actually managed to advance further in the central parts along the railway station and the railway line itself. However, Russian counterattacks managed to regain control over the area to have a solid defensive line around the intersection. To the north of this, the Ukrainians managed to regain control of the northern parts of the city, the fortifications and the forest patches, where they have been active for the past 2 months. However, they never managed to actually consolidate their positions until now. The Russians, similar to Kupyansk itself, don't have a strong concentration of forces to the north of the city, as there are only a few settlements. The largest concentration of forces was within Counterattack, which was contested for quite a while. Therefore, with the recapture of Counterattack and the fortifications near Radkivka as well as Radkivka itself, the Ukrainians have fully secured the northern flank of Kupyansk. The Russian forces will now be focusing on the eastern flank of the Usk river line, where they look to gain control of Petropavlivka and Kucherivka. Getting control of both of these settlements will allow them to have a solid supply line from the eastern flank up towards the eastern parts of Kupyansk. The limited forces of the Russians within Kupyansk has an advantage and a major disadvantage. The advantage is that even if the supply lines are cut, they can still resupply with drones for the basic necessities, that is ammunition and food and water. As long as they have those, they can continue fighting until the Ukrainians reach their positions and they eventually lose due to the numerical inferiority, which is the Ukrainian advantage with the low concentration of Russian forces in the area, and that is simply that the Ukrainians outnumber the Russians here in the western parts of Kupyansk. The Ukrainians sent a significant amount of reinforcements to push the Russians out of the city as fast as possible to regain control over it, negate weeks, if not months, of Russian advances, and at the same time be able to redirect their forces back to another section of the front line after a new defensive line has been established along the Sqkm river line. The objective being the recapture of the city itself and the prevention of encirclement of the forces operating east of the Sqkm river. So with this, we see that the Russians have been at a major setback in their positions in this area. However, it also shows exactly what sort of situation there is across the front line. And that is, when the Ukrainians concentrate their forces for an offensive, they're able to see some success, as we have seen in the Kupyansk direction. This is a big victory for the Ukrainians so far. The real question is whether they'll be able to regain full control over Kupyansk and whether or not the Russians will be able to consolidate their positions on the eastern bank of the Sqkm river line, or if this counterattack will continue and re-establish control over Kupyansk and its surroundings. So the battle is not over yet, but it has shown good results for the Ukrainians so far. And in the meantime, the Russians have had major success in the Siversk direction, gaining full control over the city there. The Counterattack direction, establishing their positions to the south of the city, in between Siversk and Counterattack, in the Chesev Yar and Solidar direction, where offensive operations have started. In the Minirat direction, where the encirclement continues, and this is a large grouping of Ukrainian forces, unlike the small grouping of Russian forces within Kupyansk. The Huliepole direction, where the Russians have gained 30% control over the city, where the Ukrainians have gained about 40% control over Kupyansk. After 3 months of fighting, the Russians have gained 30% of Huliepole after just 1 month of fighting. And additional Russian advances in the Sumi region, where they managed to regain the initiative after the Ukrainians dedicated their forces elsewhere. So what I'm really saying is the Ukrainians still have offensive capabilities that are significant. They're able to regain control of an area that is contested and has been fought over for months. However, while they are doing that, the Russians are doing the same thing in 6 different areas of the front line. Starting out in the Siversk direction, the Russians managed to gain full control over the northern flank of the city, the fortifications in between Siversk and Platonivka, gaining control over the highway between Siversk and Sqkm, and they are now fighting over the fortifications in the western flank of Siversk to the south of the highway, where they're pushing through the forest lines to gain control over these positions. At the same time, with the flanking maneuver south of Siversk towards the fortifications, the Russians managed to outflank these fortifications and gain control over the fortifications north of Sqkm, gaining control over the majority of the town, leaving just a small area in the western outskirts of it remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians now have a solid foothold within Sqkm, control over the highway between Siversk and Sqkm, and are fighting over the final fortifications on the western flank of Siversk, from where they can start offensive operations towards Sqkm from Siversk itself, acting as a logistical hub for the Russian forces, and down along the fortified line, where they're pushing through from Siversk towards Sqkm and in the western direction, as well as the operations from Solidar in the south, up towards the flank of the fortifications through Peseno, and from Sqkm down towards the flank of the fortifications in the northern flank, for a pincer maneuver attacking them from both the northern and southern flanks, which means the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw from these fortifications or risk encirclement. And this will allow the Russians to have full control over the highway from Bakhmut in the south to Siversk in the north, strengthening the logistics and connection of the forces and cooperation of the forces between these 2 sectors of the front line for offensive operations towards the western flank along the canal between the Siversk-Donetsk river line and the city of Donetsk itself. To the south of this, in the southern flank of Counterattack, the Russians managed to gain control of a wide area south of the city. This includes several fortifications and trench networks that are located to the south of the city. By outflanking these fortifications, tackling from the rear through the forest lines connected to Ivanopilia, following the capture of the town. With this, the Russians are fighting in the direction of Bereztok, where they're looking to connect their forces from the west near the TO504 highway, from the south near Yablonivka, and from the east from Ivanopilya to connect their forces in the southern flank of Konstantinivka to gain control of the southern parts of the city along the highway. To the southwest of this, the Russians consider offensive operations within Minirat, gaining control over the area in between the apartment complex area in the east and in the central parts. The Russians are quickly gaining control over what remains of Ukrainian positions within Minirat as they attack in one position after another. The Ukrainians barely have any defensive positions left within Minirat, and this means that the Battle of Minirat will likely end by the end of this year, meaning the Russians will have captured both Pokrovsk and Minirat in 2025, as well as Siversk in the eastern section of the front line. They did capture Kupyansk but have lost control over the city with the Ukrainian counterattack. As for the southwest, the Russians continue offensive operations within Hulyapole, gaining control over additional parts within the northern street north of the Haichi River, gaining control over the fortifications to the south of the river line here in the northern flank, gaining control over the area in between the two river lines, and pushing through to gain full control over the northern residential area. With this, the Russians only have a small portion remaining under Ukrainian control, following which they can start continuing their offensive operations in the southern parts of Hulyapole, where they're pushing through from the eastern flank and northern flank towards the central portion, from where the battle over the city itself will begin. Moving on to the northern section of the front line in the Sumi region, the Russians made several advances for the first time in months, where they managed to gain control over the southern outskirts of Alexivka and push on to the western direction. Following this, the Russians have now started operations to the southeast of Vereshchene in the southern direction along the highway from Yunakivka, as well as in the western direction from Alexivka towards Andrivka in the northern flank, and regain full control over Konstantinivka, pushing in the direction of Counterattack. From this, the Russians are here working on regaining control over the towns of Counterattack and Andrivka, which they lost in a counterattack by the Ukrainian forces a couple of months back. After approximately 5 months of Ukrainian counterattacks in the Sumi region, the Russians have now regained the initiative and are pushing the Ukrainians back from their attack operations and forcing them back to defense, where the Russians have already regained control over one of the 3 settlements they lost during the Ukrainian counterattack. Now they're pushing in the direction of Andrivka and Counterattack, from which they can restart their offensive operations in the Sumi region towards the defensive line located south of this, where they'll be looking to gain control of the highway leading up to the city itself. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.